Putin launched the largest coordinated strike on Kyiv in 4 years of war in the days following the May 9th ceasefire that Ukraine had permitted. More than 2,000 missiles and drones were fired across 2 nights. 24 civilians were killed. Apartment buildings collapsed. The ceasefire Ukraine had honored became the window Russia used to reload and strike harder than it had in years. Ukraine's response came 3 days later. Not a retaliatory barrage against civilian infrastructure. Not a symbolic gesture designed for headlines. What came on the night of May 17th was, in my assessment, one of the most architecturally sophisticated single-night operations Ukraine has executed since the war began. 3 simultaneous strikes against 3 categorically different arteries feeding Russia's war machine, coordinated across a geographic spread stretching from the Moscow Ring to the Crimean Peninsula. What makes this operation worth reconstructing in detail is not the scale of the individual strikes, but the logic connecting them. Each target was chosen not for its symbolic value, but for its functional role in sustaining Russia's capacity to continue the war. Understanding that logic requires looking at each layer separately before reading the full picture they form together. What follows is that reconstruction, layer by layer, target by target, strategic implication by strategic implication. If you want to understand why May 17th represents a qualitative shift in how this war is being fought at the systems level, this is the analysis. The first layer was Moscow's fuel artery. On the night of May 17th, the SBU Alpha Special Operations Unit and Ukrainian Defense Forces launched a coordinated strike that sent drones within 40 to 45 kilometers of Moscow, reaching the Rosneft-owned Solnechnogorsk fuel loading station in Durkino village in Moscow Oblast. One storage tank took a direct hit. A massive fire broke out and burned through the night. Durkino residents reported explosions throughout the early hours, confirmed by the independent Astra channel. To understand the weight of that strike, the infrastructure it targeted needs to be understood in its operational context. There is a pipeline running in a ring around Moscow, the primary artery carrying gasoline, diesel, and military fuel to the capital and its surrounding region. The Durkino station is one of the critical nodes of that ring, one of the largest oil product loading facilities in the Moscow Oblast. The pipeline it serves connects to a population of 20 million people, feeding civilian transportation, heating networks, industrial production, and military logistics simultaneously. Striking this node does not merely damage a fuel depot. It introduces pressure into the energy flow sustaining Moscow's civilian economy and the Russian military's fuel supply chain at the same time, through a single operation against a single point. That same night, the Moscow oil refinery was also struck. The night before, the Ryazan refinery, one of Russia's largest with an annual processing capacity of 17 million tons and a critical role in jet fuel production, had already caught fire. Petroleum rain was reported in the surrounding area. Further south, the Novinomysk Azot chemical plant was hit for the 6th time in 2026. One of Russia's largest producers of explosive precursor materials. The Gazprom gas processing facility in Astrakhan, 900 kilometers inside Russian territory, was targeted in the same operational window. Moscow Oblast Governor Andrei Vorobyov confirmed that infrastructure facilities had been struck, but declined to provide details. The cumulative picture by the morning of May 18th, 11% of Russia's oil refineries were out of service. Gasoline shortages had already begun appearing in regional supply networks. Ukraine had not just struck a pipeline, it had struck the backbone of Moscow's energy logistics across multiple simultaneous nodes in a single night. The second layer was the factory that builds the brain of the missile that killed civilians in Kyiv. The same night, Ukrainian drones reached Zelenograd, approximately 30 kilometers from Moscow, the Soviet-era electronics production center known informally as Russia's Silicon Valley. The target was the Angstrom factory. Angstrom is not an ordinary industrial facility. It is one of Russia's oldest and most significant microchip manufacturers. The semiconductors it produces are integrated into military communication systems, radar platforms, electronic warfare devices, and, most critically, the guidance systems of precision strike missiles. The Ukrainian General Staff stated publicly that the facility produces microelectronics, radio electronics, optical systems, and robotics components for Russia's defense industry. The United States had placed Angstrom under sanctions since 2022. The factory continued operating. The timing of this strike is, in my reading, the most analytically significant element of the entire operation. The Kh-101 cruise missile that destroyed a residential apartment building in Kyiv on May 14th had been produced in the second quarter of 2026. Despite 3 years of sanctions, components continued reaching Russian production lines. Zelensky stated it directly on the day of the Kyiv strike. Sanctions must be more painful for Russia. 3 days later, Ukraine struck Angstrom, the facility producing the guidance components for exactly that category of weapon. The message embedded in the targeting decision requires no interpretation. If the international sanctions architecture cannot physically stop production, Ukraine will stop it by destroying the production line itself. The Elma Technopark in the same area, a technology cluster housing more than 150 firms across 60,000 square meters, producing electronics and military equipment, also burned that night. The Exelenova and Astra channels confirmed the fires with footage taken from Sava Street. Reports also indicated that the MKB Raduga facility, the factory that produces Russia's cruise missiles, including the Kh-101, may have been struck in the same operation. If confirmed, Ukraine struck not only the factory producing the guidance brain of the missile that kills its civilians, but the factory producing the missile body itself, in the same night's operation. SBU Acting Chief Vasyl Malyuk addressed this directly. These operations are critically important for degrading Russia's military potential, and even the most heavily defended Moscow Oblast is no longer safe from Ukrainian reach. The third layer, and in my assessment the one carrying the greatest long-term strategic weight, was in Crimea. According to the SBU's statement, the following targets were struck at the Belbek military airbase in occupied Crimea in the same operational window: a Pantsir S-2 air defense system, a radar hangar linked to an S-400 system, Orion and four-post unmanned aerial vehicle control systems, an air traffic control tower, and an aircraft hangar. This target list needs to be read carefully because it is not a random selection of available targets. The Pantsir S-2 and the S-400 radar system together constitute the eyes and the command architecture of Crimea's air defense umbrella. In a single operation, Ukraine struck Crimea's capacity to see, to hear, and to direct its own defensive response simultaneously. The Belbek strike did not damage Crimea's air defense. It blinded it. The strategic context surrounding that blindness matters. Crimea is already operating under sustained pressure across every supply dimension. The Black Sea Fleet retreated from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk following sustained Ukrainian naval drone and missile strikes. Dragon's teeth barriers have been laid on Crimean beaches. Ukraine has achieved fire control over the land bridge. Resupply routes from Mariupol toward the peninsula are vulnerable to medium-range drone interdiction. The air defense eyes at Belbek were not the first element of Crimea's defensive architecture to be struck. They are one more link in a systematic dismantlement that has been advancing since 2023. In 2023, Ukraine could not reach Crimea with ground forces and stopped at the Savash line. In 2026, it is advancing toward the same strategic objective through a different mechanism: the methodical destruction of the infrastructure that makes Crimea defensible. The technological dimension of the May 17th operation is, in my view, the most operationally disturbing element for Russian planners. The Ukrainian General Staff officially disclosed for the first time the specific weapon systems deployed in the attack: the RS-1 Bars, a jet-powered unmanned aerial vehicle; the FP-1 Firepoint, a winged strike drone; and the Bars SM Gladiator, a system that had appeared in no public database, had been known to no independent analyst, and entered operational use for the first time that night. Ukraine's operational weapons inventory expanded in public view during a combat operation. Russia's air defense network, which was already managing responses to multiple different drone types simultaneously, now faces a system it has never encountered, whose flight profile, electronic signature, and terminal behavior are entirely unknown to its operators. Among the targets Russia's defense ministry claimed to have intercepted, the list included the Flamingo long-range cruise missile and the Neptune MD guided missile. The Flamingo is a system that Germany had considered procuring as a Tomahawk alternative. which would indicate its first confirmed operational use by Ukraine if the Russian claim is accurate. 4 separate Ukrainian units coordinated in this operation: the 412th Separate Unmanned Systems Brigade, the 107th Rocket Artillery Brigade, the 19th Missile Brigade St. Barbara, and the 1st Separate Unmanned Systems Center. Russia's official claim of intercepting 1,054 drones requires a specific analytical reading. That figure does not demonstrate defensive success. It demonstrates the scale of the attack Ukraine was able to organize and sustain. Even accepting the Russian intercept claim at face value, enough systems penetrated to burn Angstrom, to ignite Durkino, and to collapse the radar hangar at Belbek. The arithmetic of a mass drone operation does not require every system to reach its target. It requires enough systems to reach their targets that the defensive network cannot prevent meaningful damage while intercepting the majority. Russia's own reported figure confirms that Ukraine achieved exactly that. The Moscow air defense perimeter is the densest concentration of air defense infrastructure in Russia. S-300 and S-400 batteries, Pantsir systems, electronic warfare platforms. Russia invested, by any reasonable estimate, trillions of rubles constructing a multi-layered defense umbrella over its capital. Zelensky addressed this directly after the operation. Ukrainian long-range systems now reach the Moscow region 500 kilometers away. Air defense is most heavily concentrated there, and Ukraine is overcoming it. 4 words that, in my assessment, invalidate Russia's single largest domestic security investment of the past decade. There is an additional dimension to the Moscow strikes that carries political weight independent of the military effects. Russia's air defense response to the incoming drone waves caused its own civilian casualties. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin announced 3 dead and 12 injured. Casualties caused not by Ukrainian drone warheads, but by debris from Russian air defense intercepts and electronic warfare activity striking residential structures. A skyscraper sustained impact from falling debris. Sheremetyevo, Moscow's primary international airport, was closed with fire and heavy smoke visible on the runway approach. Russia spent trillions on the umbrella. The umbrella was penetrated, and the pieces falling through the gaps hit Russian citizens in their own capital. Moscow is no longer a city watching this war from a distance. It is a city living it. Airports close. Runways catch fire. Explosions are audible at night. Debris falls on apartment buildings. 20 million people now go to bed and wake up within the operational radius of Ukrainian strike systems. The cascade logic of these strikes is worth tracing explicitly because it extends from Moscow to the front line through multiple interconnected chains. When a refinery is struck, jet fuel production decreases. When jet fuel production decreases, Russian Air Force sortie rates drop. When sortie rates drop, glide bomb delivery against Ukrainian frontline positions slows. When glide bomb pressure eases, Ukrainian defensive lines stabilize. When Angstrom is struck, precision guidance component production is disrupted. When missile production slows, Russia's deep strike capacity against Ukrainian cities decreases. When air defense infrastructure at Belbek is struck, Crimea's defensive umbrella weakens. When it weakens, the threshold for the next Ukrainian operation against the peninsula drops. Every strike in this sequence makes the next strike in the sequence operationally easier. Russia's war machine does not absorb these strikes and recover to baseline. It absorbs them and recovers to a slightly lower baseline each time. And the rate of degradation has, in my reading of the available data, clearly surpassed the rate of repair. The balance requires honest assessment on both sides of the ledger. Russia retains massive strike capacity. It demonstrated this by firing more than 2 Zuzan missiles and drones over 2 nights following the May 9th ceasefire. It stockpiled weapons during the ceasefire window and deployed that stockpile against civilian targets with deliberate ruthlessness. Russia's missile inventories have not been depleted, and it retains the capacity to continue striking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. This is not a picture of a military that has been strategically neutralized. The distinction that matters, however, is what each side is choosing to target with that capacity. Russia strikes civilian apartment buildings. Ukraine strikes Angstrom, Durkino, and the Belbek radar hangar. Russia deploys its strike capacity to generate a terror effect on the Ukrainian population. Ukraine deploys its strike capacity to degrade the industrial and logistical infrastructure, sustaining Russia's ability to continue the war. One side produces fear. The other produces strategic damage that accumulates in ways fear does not. The 24 civilians killed in Kyiv during Russia's May attack represent a pain that no military analysis can or should minimize. But Ukraine's response directed that pain, in my assessment, not blindly, but with surgical precision toward the specific nodes in Russia's production and logistics chain, most directly responsible for generating the weapons that killed them. Ukraine's strike range trajectory tells its own story. Over 1,000 kilometers in 2024, over 1,500 kilometers in 2025, over 2,000 kilometers in 2026. There is no safe rear area remaining anywhere in Russia. Putin took the war to Ukraine. Ukraine is returning it, not to civilian apartments, but to the refineries, the microchip factories, the radar hangars, and the fuel loading stations that feed the machine making the war possible. Malyuk's statement after the operation was unambiguous. These operations will continue. The choices sitting on Putin's table after May 17th are, in my view, uniformly bad. He can prioritize Moscow's protection by repositioning additional air defense assets from the front lines to the capital, which leaves the front and Crimea more exposed to Ukrainian air operations. He can prioritize frontline defense and accept that Moscow will continue to absorb strikes, which means every successful strike against the capital further erodes the domestic narrative that the war is being fought safely at a distance. Or he can escalate. But Ukraine's Flamingo is already being discussed as a Tomahawk alternative on the international market, and escalation amplifies the response it is intended to suppress. None of these options changes the fundamental equation. Ukraine's strike capacity grows every month. Russia's defensive capacity erodes every month. Those two curves crossed some time ago and continue to diverge. The front reflects the same trajectory. Russia's spring 2026 offensive has collapsed. In April, Russia lost net territory for the first time since August 2024, absorbing close to 100,000 casualties in the process. Monthly casualties are running at approximately 35,000, while monthly mobilization stands at roughly 27,000. The army is consuming itself faster than it can reconstitute. The front is not only being lost at the contact line. It is being lost in Moscow, in Ryazan, in Zelenograd, and in Crimea simultaneously. Before 2026 ends, the question of Crimea's status may return to active negotiating consideration, not because Ukraine has reached it with ground forces, but because Ukraine has made it progressively indefensible through systematic air and drone operations against its defense infrastructure. That is a different path to the same strategic destination, and it is the path currently being walked. Putin's core domestic promise throughout this war has been that the conflict would not come home, that Moscow would remain safe, that 20 million Muscovites would go to bed and wake up without hearing explosions. That promise collapsed on the night of May 17th. And Malyuk's forward assessment of what follows is the most strategically significant public statement made by any Ukrainian official in recent weeks. These operations will continue. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what May 17th actually represented beyond the individual strike reports, share it with someone still reading only the headline casualty figures. And if you want breakdowns that go into the strategic architecture connecting these operations, rather than just the nightly damage summaries, follow along. There is considerably more to unpack.